Okay, so you've seen that that imposition config. Of course, we still need a way to apply it, and the easiest way, of course, is to do it using using actions and so on. So, for if anyone is not familiar with that, what I've done as a next step is, when you go to the switchboard and you look at the imposition part, impose, I can select the sheet config and the run list file that I want, and then from there you have to create an action. So create new switchboard action. I've given that a name, and then once you've done that, it will show up in a process plan. So I can create, well, if I'm in the right spot, I can create a process plan, add the action that I want, and that action can be the imposition thing. So that's going to be the first step of the whole process. Is you're going to create a process plan where we do that imposition step. And then the second step, of course, is what we're going to do now, which is create the place content template that we want. And that place content template in the second step is then going to add the additional text and the barcode and so on top of the imposed file. And this is typically how you would do this for all these proof page things. They might all look different, but in most cases you can simply implement it by doing an imposition step that takes whatever comes in and places it on the right page size, and then run a second HTML-based place content that adds the additional information. Now, what Yves said before the break is that the file is still going to be heavy. If I have a heavy incoming file, then of course I'm going to get a proof that is very heavy as well, because I'm not doing anything to the file quality. We could, of course, insert an additional fixup that downsamples the incoming document, or does whatever else you want to do to the incoming document to make it lighter, and then place it or then use it as the source of the imposition step. And that would give us a proof that is also lighter, has lower quality.
Do you have the library there that you have as VIP event Vienna? Can you share that with us?
I can share that at some point, yes. Yes, not now. It's from this point on. It's a little bit difficult to follow along, I think, but because we only have 45 minutes left. But still, I will share it. No worries.
How much?
What? Now, if you have to ask how much it costs, you can't afford it. So, this is the last step, and this is actually my last slide, because the rest I'm going to simply take you through the different templates that I've prepared. But this is the next step that we have to do. We have to make a place content template, and this is where it becomes really difficult, because, well, at least for me it does. I have a tendency of wanting to do the whole thing in one go. And then the result is usually that you end up with something that doesn't work, and then it takes you 2 days to fix it. So this is an attempt to structure it, and I was amazed at how well it worked. Maybe in the future, when I do professional service work, I can use my same structure and save some time. 6 steps. You probably don't really need all 6 of them, but it shows you how you can take small steps to get there. The first thing is what you probably already did, which is download this template from GitHub. And when you download this thing from GitHub, you get a template that works. So I can use that in place content. But there is probably not much that is going to happen. So if I look at what I have here, 1 second, I need a penguin. So, which penguin today? Ah, nice. So, if I look at this this process plan, I have created a number of different fixups, and each of these fixups, of course, uses one of the example templates. The first step is what I just said. It's simply downloading what you have on GitHub, and when I run that, so there's a bunch of variables in there. Okay. So when I run that, this is what happens. This is kind of what I expected. I downloaded this template from GitHub. It works, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't add anything. It has basically empty, an empty HTML file in there. So this is just to show you that it will actually work. In fact, however, if I start looking at it, you'll see that I should have seen something. And if you've downloaded this thing from GitHub, you're able to see the same thing. So let me open this in Sublime. This is version 1. If I look at the index.html, as you would expect it from me, there are already penguins in this template. So I should have seen these appear on my file, right? There is HTML content in there, but if I look at the result, there's nothing there. The reason there is nothing there is that my template, as it lives on GitHub, generates an A4 page, but it generates a portrait A4 page, which means the penguins are added, but they're somewhere above the file, so they're not visible. They're outside of the visible area of this landscape file. Okay? But that's not important. We download this template, and that's the important part, because it gives us something that we can work with. Now, the second step that I do is I clean this thing up, and that's not unimportant by itself. Yeah? So remove excess information from the template and set the page size. Those are the two things I'm going to do. The reason I want to do that is clear when you start looking at this template. So this is what I downloaded from GitHub. And what you can see is the styles folder, which I said is your styles file in there. So this is the styles file that you can adjust. The template only defines a particular font definition, and it defines the color of all text as basically CMYK black, because if you don't do that, you end up with RGB black, and that's probably not what you want. It has a script file with some stuff in it, and this is mainly to show you how to get started as well. It doesn't do anything. It's just there to as a placeholder template. But if I look in the rest of the file, I have a manifest file, and the manifest file actually asks for everything. Why? Well, it's simpler for you to download the templates and remove the stuff that you don't want than it is to figure out from the documentation how to request the stuff that you want. So the template asks for everything. And it also, in the library portion, when you look at scripts, it has a whole bunch of scripts in there. And in the HTML file, it includes all of those scripts. Why? Again, it's easier to look at what you need and then keep that and throw away the rest than it would be to manually figure out how to add these things to it. So the template does too much if you want. Once you downloaded it, it will by default do too much. Now, it's not going to make a lot of difference. If you don't use those JavaScript files, they're not going to add 2 minutes to the processing time. But if you want to do it nicely, you should, after you've downloaded it and you verify that it worked without changing it, you should change it. And that's what my version 2 does. It removed all the extra requests from the manifest XML. And if I show you the index.html, you now see that I only have the JavaScript files that I think I'm going to need in this particular template. The rest has been removed. Yeah? So this step merely does some cleanup. Now, what is all this stuff that you have in here? That's a very good question. When you look at libraries, you'll see 3 folders in that callas library folder. The first one is fonts, and that's the easiest one. That contains, because it's simple to then test something, it contains a font that can be freely distributed. That's why it's there. So you can use that, but of course the intention would probably be that you use your own font if you build your own proofing page. And then it has a script folder and a styles folder. I'll start with the styles folder that has a cleanup CSS. And that cleanup CSS has only one rule. It says for all elements, set the margins to 0, set padding to 0. It says something about box sizing, and it sets the background color to transparent. There are cases where this is not a good idea. Yeah? But generally, probably in about 99% of the cases, this is really helpful. It cleans up all the mess you normally have in HTML. It makes sure that you have no margins, no padding, and you know, after this, you know that if you want margin somewhere around an element, you have to define it. But you don't have to live with all of the sometimes stupid defaults that a browser will set. Not stupid in an HTML website context, perhaps, but stupid when you think of it in terms of pdfToolbox. Yeah? So that's a cleanup thing. The second CSS file that you have here defines what you need to do for this font that is delivered with the template as well. This just makes sure that you can use that font in your CSS rules that you make. Again, you don't have to use it, but I would ask you to look at the syntax that is here, because this one is right. Most of the syntax in the examples, also the ones shipped with pdfToolbox, is wrong. Yeah, it's wrong because we didn't know any better. Actually, this is the correct way of doing it. You define a font family, you link that to the font file, and then for example, for the bold, you set the font weight. For anything that is italic, you set the font style. And if I now, on a paragraph level in my CSS, say that I want something in italic, the browser, or the pdfToolbox engine in this case, is automatically going to connect that to this particular font definition, and so the italic version of the file. And then the last one is some examples. This is not very extensive. It might grow in the future, but this is some easy stuff that you can use. So if you give something a class of bold, then it is automatically going to set the font weight to bold. Same for italic. And there are some examples of color classes if you want as well. So you can add these things to an element to make it black or to make it, well, red and so on. You don't have to use these, but the CSS files are there if you want to use them. And then you have a whole bunch of JavaScript files. Not all of them are ours. You have the jQuery, which is normal, I guess. There is a mix-in for jQuery that had to do with images, and there is one that has to do with SVG. Those are JavaScript library files that have been downloaded from the internet, and you can download the latest version if you want. But those are of course not things that we have written. All the ones that have this callas prefix in front of them are JavaScripts that have been written specifically for place content. If you look at the existing templates or the existing examples in pdfToolbox, you'll see that there are different JavaScript files. The content is largely the same. The difference is that this has been split up into a little bit of more files. For example, there is a debug JavaScript, there is a unit JavaScript. That means that you can include only the ones that you think you need for a particular project. Yeah? It also makes it a little bit easier for us. I'm assuming that as time goes by that we are going to add additional code to this, this makes it easier to do that. It's been cleaned up a little bit. Unfortunately, this is not compatible with what you have today. There is a little bit of work you have to do to use this new template because some of the function names have been changed. There is a little bit more JavaScript objects that are used instead of simply text strings that I never could remember. So it's not just compatible with what we have in the examples today, but it's altogether better structured and I think higher quality code to go forward. And the HTML in the template, like I said, includes all of that stuff. So what I did in version 2 is I removed everything that I think I didn't need. And then in scripts and styles, I didn't do much. The only thing I did was under styles, where I define a landscape page. So the default for pdfToolbox, if you don't do anything, is an A4 portrait page. This CSS statement changes that to landscape. So the output of my action is now a landscape page. This sounds like a trivial step, and it doesn't do that much, but it's still very useful. And if I run this now, so I didn't make special process plans for all of them, which means that I have to change the template that I'm using here. If I run this and we place it on our desktop again, notice that it didn't change anything. The only thing it changed is that I now have penguins on there as I would expect. Why? Because the page size is now correct. So it generates a portrait, landscape file, and that means that this HTML that I have in there appears where it's supposed to appear. Make sense? Fairly easy. Okay. The next step that I do here is, instead of trying to position everything individually, which is something that I've done in a number of examples before, you could say, well, we know that we have this this portrait page. I know that I want to have that word there and then a bunch of text there, and you can position all of these things individually. What I want to do here is I want to take advantage of the fact that I have an HTML engine, and HTML engines are very good at layout. So why would I specify the position of each text line separately if I can have the engine, the HTML engine, calculate that for me? Of course, you still have to say where the big blocks of content are going to go, and that's exactly what I'm doing in version 3. So let me just run that, because I think it generates something visual, if I remember correctly. Take our document and nice. So what I did is I added, in this next iteration, I added 3 blocks in HTML speak divs, one for the header, one for the footer, and then one for the side content. This is just a div. There is nothing else in terms of content, and if you look at the template, you'll see that this is an almost trivial change. The HTML itself now has containers in it. Yeah? Instead of these pigment text I had, there are now containers, and each container has an ID, up, down, and left. And in the CSS file that goes with my templates, each of these containers has an absolute position. The left one, for example, defines the left and the top, and then the width and the height, And then for now, I've given them a background color so that I can check that what I calculated was correct. That same page where I did the measurements to figure out where the imposition step should go, you can use exactly the same technique, of course. The only problem, unfortunately, is that the coordinate system here is different. Absolute positioning in HTML has a coordinate system that starts at so PDF starts at the bottom left corner. HTML takes the top left corner. So the measurements you see here, when I say left, it's from the left-hand side. When I say top, it means calculate from here to the top of the container. So that you have to realize that the measurement system is different. But other than that, it's exactly the same as we did for the imposition. I simply defined 3 rectangular areas on the page, and I've given them a background color so that I see where they are. You can skip the background color, of course. I mean, but my experience is if I skip the background color and I visually check that they are in the right space, then I start adding content. I wonder why it doesn't show up where I think it shows up, and I figure out that I did something wrong. So I kind of don't skip that step anymore. Does that still make sense? So why the containers? Again, the containers are here because I don't want to calculate everything. It is really annoying to calculate where these 14 pieces of text need to go, especially for the text where you have a header and then the content underneath, because you have to get it exactly correct. Yeah? If you have to calculate that one by one, it's going to take you a lot of time and it's going to be very boring. This is a better technique. You define the big areas on the page, and then once we have done that, we'll take the next step, and the next step is that we add content. And that does exactly what you would expect. So if I look at the HTML for the next step, I now have my containers, and in each container I have the content that I want to show in there. In a very simple way, and there's multiple ways you can do that. I mean, you're free to design your HTML the way you want, but basically any element that needs to be replaced afterwards, so any element that is variable gets an ID job name, and IDs are unique, and you can use that afterwards with scripting to take what comes in as a variable and replace that. And then these classes that you see here are done simply so that I can assign the right format to it. So here I use a key value approach. The key is the title, the value is what was displayed or what is going to be displayed under it. Again, I could have taken 2 steps at once and also have done the formatting and so on, but again, my experience is that makes it very difficult, and you typically shoot yourself in the foot if you do that. So what I've done here is I've added the content, and when I run that thing, I've added the content, but I have not attempted to do any styling. So this only verifies that the content shows up in the right places. Yeah? And some of the content you can't see because my default text color in here is red. Yeah? So I have done some styling. But you see the content show up. It's where I would expect it to be. It's in this container that we drew on the side, so that's good. The other content is actually here. I can see it actually, but it's hard to see on the projection. So there is some stuff there, and there is some stuff at the top. So it ended up in the right space, but of course it is not styled correctly. And because it showed up in the right place, that means that I can now do the same thing. But now I can say, well, time to get our styling correct. So the next step I do is, well, I think it's the styling that I do. Yes. So the next thing we do is not just put the content there, but also get the font style and colors and so on correct. And that looks much better already. It's never going to look the same as our Illustrator example, because the Illustrator example is it uses different font and so on, and I didn't want to use that font in an example that I share afterwards. But you can see that the text color is correct. It actually ends up in the right spot, which is simple. This one has been set float to left. The other one is float to right, so it automatically goes to the two sides of the container that we put it in. All this text was in one big container, if you remember. So I played with a little margin in between to space them out correctly, and then the colors are set correctly to have them there as well. So this is actually starting to look a lot like what we want, right? There is only one thing missing, and what is missing is that I have a whole bunch of penguins in there, and that's not what it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to have this content from these variables that come in. My fixup defines the variables. I've done that from the first iteration. So if I look here, and I'm going to select version 6 meanwhile. If you look here, in this parameter called variables, I've defined all the things I want to use from the outside. Yeah, they're just not used at the moment. I've defined them here, and the process plan asks me what I want to use, but the HTML template doesn't use them yet. And that's what we do in the last iteration. So I didn't do that right, did I? I think I screwed up my example there. Anyway. So the last iteration, if I run this again, I can place that on my desktop again. You get this. And then I think I have to have something in capitals there. Yes. And we end up with this. So now it not only took the content and put it in there, but it also replaced the text on the template with what we fed in as a variable. Like I said, I will share this stuff. What you should remember is that the barcode type I use here is a type that can only deal with uppercase characters. And if you have lowercase characters in there, the fixup will fail and you will never figure out why. How do we do that? Well, that's not that difficult, and you don't actually have to do much for that. The only thing you have to do is in this template. So if I look here, you'll see that there is some scripting that has been filled in now. But the scripting is actually very, very self-explanatory. I look for an element with a particular ID, and I change the text of that element, and then I use a function. And this is one of the functions that is defined in one of these library JavaScripts. I look for a variable with that particular name. So that is the variable that has been defined at the fixup level, and this function simply gets this from the JSON file that was delivered with it. And then there are a few where we do some things that are a little bit more interesting. For example, I ask for the page or the trim box information, and then I format that as millimeters. This function is also something that you find in those JavaScript files in the templates, but it basically takes the size of the file and shows that. And then there is another little function that you can use to update the information of the barcode that is in there as well. Barcodes need a little bit of special treatment because simply setting the value, a new value in the barcode, doesn't have the result of updating the barcode in the HTML. You have to do some additional magic, and this function does it for you. So does that make sense? So again, you don't have to follow this. You don't have to, as far as I'm concerned, you write this in one go. You certainly don't have to make individual fix-ups if you don't want. But my experience with doing this for a while now is that it becomes a lot easier if you follow either this structure or something similar that you feel comfortable with. By splitting it up in a number of smaller steps, you're going to know where you're making mistakes. If you try to do everything at the same time, it's going to feel like saving time, but in the end, you're going to spend more time figuring out why certain things don't work. This is a very structured approach where in small increments you get to where you want. And creating this doesn't actually take that much time. Questions about any of this? Because my time is up, so. Does this make sense? Is it still rocket science? I can show that movie again if you want to compare. Yeah?
The problem is that the failures when you do a typing error or something like this are lots less spectacular than the
Yes.
you showed. So
Yes.
the learning curve is not that steep.
Correct, but for typos and so on, and that is something I have not said, but something that you should know as well, is if you look at these folders, so each of these templates, you have that callas temp folder that I mentioned. Yeah, the PDF file that is in there is the result PDF created by pdfToolbox. So if we look at that one, that should actually show us something. So this is the PDF file that was generated. There seems to be text missing, but that's because it's white, of course. You have to be careful. But what is also important is that there is a log file. And that log file will show you when something is going wrong. So if you make a script and there is a JavaScript error in it, for example, that log file will have the full error message of that. In that log, you can write to that log file as well. There is in one of those library JavaScripts, the one that is callas _ debug. There is I think something called debug log that helps you to log a line of text or the value of a variable to this log file as well. So you can, it's not as good as debugging, but you can get some information about what happens during your template processing. Because the error that pdfToolbox itself gives is very, very cryptical in most cases, but the full one is in there. And like I said, that debug log function can be quite helpful for that as well.